Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. We are on take number 2 of the second part because we had some technical issues, but we are back. We were just discussing the fact that we maybe do actually have a name for the podcast. All I said is it is capital T, capital P, the podcast. But last time we established
the podcast that shall not be named.
Yeah. We're just going to make it longer every week until we have a full sentence going down. But welcome back to the podcast. Last week we did call it tentatively Beer Time with Books. That was the tentative term. But for this podcast, we're going to start it off the same way. We're going to introduce everybody that's on the podcast today and what we're drinking.
Hi, I'm Jaimie. I'm back. I'm drinking the same thing as everybody else. I'll introduce it. It's Isolation Ale by Odell Brewing. This makes it seem like we really love Odell Brewing. We don't.
An unofficial sponsor.
We're gonna see how our tastes evolve as the podcast goes on.
But that's it.
I'm Dani. I'm also back. I drink whatever beer that Jaimie and Brian have in their fridge, and it's not an IPA.
And that would be the same thing as Jaimie. That's the Isolation Ale, Odell Brewing Company. I'm Brian. I'm also back. Apparently, we're doing that. We're just if we were on the last podcast, we have to specify that we're back. But last week, like I said, we just did an introductory episode, and we mentioned that we had some books that we were going to discuss, and we will be getting to that. But I thought that it'd be kind of fun at the beginning. So basically how we're structuring the podcast from now on is each of us are going to lead some discussion. So I'm for the next 2 episodes because I chose Lincoln and the Bardo. Jaimie, you'll be doing
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
So that'll be the 2 after these 2, and then Dani.
I'm doing 100 Years of Solitude.
Awesome. So before we get into today's book, I just kind of want to ask, have there been any other interesting pieces of media that you've been consuming recently? Because I think that'll be kind of cool as the podcast goes along to see like what we're doing on the side. Because obviously this didn't take us our entire like life from last podcast to this one to really
all I've been doing.
So does anybody want to start?
I can start, I guess. Interesting media I have been consuming. I am watching Game of Thrones for the first time.
Woo woo.
So that's exciting. Brian
Dun, 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 dun.
Brian wanted me to watch it, and I never have. And we talked in the last episode of the pod about how I'm finally getting into fantasy in my old age. So I'm enjoying it. We just finished the first season of Game of Thrones. We went through it in like a week and a half.
Yeah,
I think.
It's been fun.
I like it. Yeah, I have feelings and thoughts, and I know everybody else has already read them and already seen it, but I would prefer a show that was just about Khaleesi.
Fair enough.
I would watch that spinoff.
Yeah, that's all I want.
Dani?
I recently started watching The Great British Baking Show.
My parents keep talking about that, and my brother-in-law and my sister, they love it.
I thought that I wouldn't like I didn't see any reason why I would be interested in it. And then I just was like, oh, this seems light. I'm going to put it on. And then I watched a season and a half last weekend.
Nice.
And it's just nice and so like non-competitive, and they're just so lovely on it. And like they even help each other when the challenges are like the time is up, and like they are helping each other at their stations. It's really nice. It's like refreshing and wholesome.
Yeah, after lots of Gordon Ramsay calling people idiot sandwich.
It's the opposite of that. And
you're a smart sandwich. you're a smart one.
I just didn't think that I was going to be interested in it. And then by like the 5th episode, I was like, oh, clearly that tart is underbaked.
That's of course he did.
Like,
he's like had all of these things that he's learning about tarts specifically.
Extremely underbaked. I would never, So that, and then I also started listening to My Favorite Murder 2 weeks ago, which is not super new. But I had just never listened to it, and I really like it. I'm 20 episodes in, and it's good for true crime.
Nice. And recently, obviously, Jaimie mentioned Game of Thrones. We're making our way through that. I've been playing a lot of the Fallout video game series, and I've been enjoying that a lot. It's made me listen to a lot of 1940s jazz, because that's the soundtrack of the game. Yeah, it is very specific. As I go around,
jazz. It's like
not all
big
jazz.
bands.
Yeah,
like
I mean that's jazz, big band.
I know, but it's like
they had the
kinda-
Beach
it's like
Boys in like
pop
Fallout
music.
76.
It's like
yeah.
1940s pop music.
Yeah, and it's fun. I like the game a lot, and I like the storytelling as a part of it, and as a fan of books, I do enjoy a good story, and I think that in certain instances that game does nail it quite a bit. So that's been the media we've been consuming, but for this week, the very specific thing we'll be talking about for the second episode of the podcast and our first book of the podcast, we're going to be talking about Lincoln and the Bardo by George Saunders. And we had kind of been discussing a list of books that we wanted to read for the podcast, and I had been wanting to read it for a while. This book was talked about extensively on BookTube, and a lot of people absolutely loved it, and it won the Man Booker Prize. So it had garnered a lot of praise from all sorts of places, and so it seemed like it was up my alley. It had the historical fiction aspect, and there were a couple other things that I had seen that it kind of uses an experimental structure. And so I thought it'd be fun for the podcast, and we read, as we mentioned last week, about halfway through the book. And so we read all the way up to page 176 for anybody following along. That's the end of the first part. And so I'll be leading the discussion for the next 2 weeks, and I'm really excited about it because the book has been a lot of fun, and it was funny to hear the thoughts of both of you guys during the week, because there were very particular moments. One of the first things that Jaimie said to me was, after she had started it, she mentioned something that's also going to be a new segment for the podcast, the Too Long Don't Read Titles. and that's TLDR Titles. Yeah. So Jaimie mentioned that it was.
Oh yeah, I said that I had only read like maybe 3 or 4 chapters of the book, and I said it reminded me of the Eddie Murphy classic Haunted Mansion.
I have seen that. Eddie
Yes.
Murphy triggered
Oh,
it. It did
so
it for
it's
me.
only me. I was gonna say.
Did it
so
for me.
I said that I didn't know what you were talking about, and I told Dani about it in our group text, but I have never seen the movie.
Yeah, so Haunted Mansion, if you haven't seen it, is a Disney film in which Eddie Murphy with his family moves into an old house that is haunted, and all of the ghosts are like really whimsical and kind of funny. And that's what this book reminded me of.
The characters are, yeah.
Except I told Brian it was sophisticated Haunted Mansion because it's definitely not a Disney movie.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Even not having seen it, this does not quite have the Disney vibe, but that's the TLDR title. We're going to have one for every book, and that's the one for this one, and probably the title of this episode. And also,
I think it should be the title. TLDR,
TL.
Sophisticated Haunted Mansion.
And so for Dani also, she had texted when we had a group message going, and Dani had asked if she wanted, or if she could read more. She got to the end of the section, and she said this is the quote here. She said, "Are we allowed to talk about the book over text outside the pod? Next text, because all caps, I love it." And so after that, we said what we had been saying for a little bit after the last one, #save it for the pod. So we're there officially. Save it for the pod. We're on the pod. So what part were you at? I guess you had just gotten to the end of it, and you were excited to read more. What was kind of spurring you on at that point?
I think I was like 30 pages from the end of part 1. And I mostly just, I think whimsical is a really good word to describe the characters so far. I just really enjoy the comic relief and also like their ability to, I don't know, like be serious at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I was really enjoying the characters, and I don't think there was a specific moment. I think I was just getting close to the end of part 1, and I was like, I don't have another book with me. Yeah. I really want to be able to, I didn't think about this. I want to be able to read more, but But yeah, I mean, we talked about this. I was pleasantly surprised at kind of how, like, it's a quick read, but there's a lot of substance to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the thing is I really didn't know that much about the book before going in. I thought it was going to be a lot more sad than it actually ended up being. But we will get to that in a second. I think it is important when we're getting to talking about the first part of the book that obviously that's going to be very different than where we're at the end, where we have the majority of the story, or at that point, all of the story. A lot of what happens with your first impressions, at least for me, and you guys can kind of share your thoughts on this as well, but my first impressions are often on the structure of the story. And there was a very unique text structure to this one, obviously. Anybody that's picked up the book, if you're in the middle of it right now listening to this podcast, you know what we're talking about. But I think it really creates a unique experience if it's, playing with typical structures of a novel. Oftentimes you'll tell somebody if you're reading a book like, oh, this one has short chapters. Like, that's an easy thing to tell somebody. And that's like Cat's Cradle, for instance. That's what I've recommended to a ton of people because it has really short, succinct chapters. You'll say like, oh, it's dialogue only. There's J.R. by William Gaddis. It's all dialogue. That's just stuff that you tell people. So on this one, it is kind of unique. And I wanted to kind of get your guys's take on the structure that you saw. I know, Dani, you had some thoughts specifically that you didn't necessarily like. So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I really don't have a problem with like the structure. The only thing that I don't like is that I don't know. It was confusing to me at first. It's written kind of. It struck me like it was written like a play almost. Like it feels like a play. Because of the way that the dialogue is written, centered, and then like the names of the people who are speaking are under the dialogue. But it just seemed a little bit confusing to me because like you don't see, it's easy to see like visually, but like you don't notice necessarily who's talking immediately once when you start reading what they're saying. You read what they're saying and then you see who's saying it. At least that's how it felt to me.
Yeah.
And so I was a little confused at first. We joked when I said that I got to the end of part 1. Brian said, read it again. And then I was like, that isn't a bad idea.
Then it actually happened. Yeah.
And I read like a third of it again and I picked
Which
up.
I'm impressed. I'm impressed that actually happened.
For the record, I never do that. I have never reread a book so quickly. But I wanted to see what else I could pick up. And so I definitely picked up more. It was less confusing the second time because I knew, I was familiar with the characters and everything, of course, but I just was a little confused. I'm confused why he chose this, or I'm interested in why he chose this structure because to me, if you're going to write it kind of this way, like I would like to see the characters' names, like, in like you see in a script,
right.
You see their name and then you see what they say.
Yeah, that confused me at the beginning as well. It took me a second and that's something that I personally enjoy. I like experimental structures in novels. And I like the feeling of getting lost because of that, because you're learning that style. And I won't say that it took, obviously, that long, because a few pages in, you understand where, because like the chapter ends, for instance, or it's like the first text of the chapter, and you start to realize that is how it's written. But I like being able to have the author teach me as I go, which like in this it's pretty easy because you're just going to naturally be going quickly along with it. But that's something that I always enjoy. But I know that Jaimie had also said that she had some confusion at the beginning when we talked about it. Do you want to talk about kind of the experience with you at the beginning?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. But what Brian's referring to is I started the book before anybody else, and I went into it like not knowing anything about it. I knew Abraham Lincoln was involved, and that's literally all I knew. I didn't read the back of the book. I didn't know it was like about his son dying, which also we haven't mentioned at all what the book is about.
Oh yeah,
we'll get there.
Okay. But I didn't know it was about his son dying. I didn't know that there were like ghost characters. I knew absolutely nothing about it. And the first 2 pages don't have that structure. Like you don't see anybody being like cited.
Right.
You don't have like a reader that's called out to you. And so I read the first 2 pages and I was really interested in this story of this guy getting married to this young woman and like all this. And then it suddenly changed and like other people were talking and I did not know what was happening. I was like fully like, I don't know who these people are. I don't know why this is happening. And then the next chapter was all different people and like historical
citations,
excerpts. Which also, that's the thing that when I look at the structure of this, it feels like, because I think my theory is that because it's like a historical fiction novel and he's basing it in reality, some of the citations I think Brian said are real, like from historical documents.
I looked it up and some of them.
I wondered about that.
The structure reminds me of an academic article of like you're quoting this and then at the end of the sentence you cite it, like MLA format. Which I think that maybe that's purposeful. Like it feels more of like a found document than a play where you're like definitely telling people what to say. But I had to reread the first 3 chapters like multiple times until I was like, okay, I think I know who these people are. I think I know what's happening. I think I understand where we're at in this story. And I really enjoy it. I like the way that it's structured. But it did take me a while. And honestly, if I don't know if I should admit this about myself, but if I weren't reading this for the podcast and like had this accountability, I might have read the first couple chapters, got really confused, and then just put it down and not picked it up again. Which like would have been a bummer because I really enjoy it. But that's how frustrated I was the first time I read it. I was like, what is going on?
Yeah. And that's the thing that I had heard from a lot of previous reviews is that because of the way that it's written, because it's unconventional, it threw a lot of people for a loop, even people that were used to, experimental structures from previous books that they've read. But most people seem to have the experience, like I was talking about a little bit earlier, of having the author teach you. And sometimes it is more difficult to have the author do that, depending on how experimental or complex it's going to be. But I like the way that, when you get to those different chapters that have stuff that's rooted in reality, the works cited kind of train of thought makes a lot more sense when you get to those, because they are all based in reality and you're able to tell that really easily. And you obviously know that you're there because you get to a chapter and instead of just having one name, there's like a whole list of whatever article or book it's from and the author as well. And I will say, as far as some of them being true, I don't know that all of them are, because there are some in here that the way he cites it kind of led me to believe that, and I think there was an interview with him as well, that led me to believe that they're not all true, but there are some that are.
Yeah, I really enjoy the like citation structure of it. Now that you mention like it being like a citation like MLA format, it makes a lot of sense. But I was just like thrown for a loop, like you said, until like the third, I don't know, what is it, like the third chapter or the first few pages. Then they start talking about, like they start having citations. And so then I was like flipping back and forth and I was like, who's speaking? What is happening? Are these people real? And then I was like, I should have probably looked it up, but I was like, are these people real? Are these real books? Like,
I was super concerned. Also, the reason I reread the first few chapters partially was in the second and third chapter, it's like historical documents, like citing like this person said this in this book or this letter or whatever. And I was so concerned that I needed to know who all those people were. Yeah. Like I was trying to remember who said what, which I don't think is important, except for like the main 3 characters.
Yeah.
And I think that is an interesting point due to our different reading styles, because obviously this is one that I had chosen. I said I like a lot of books that have more experimental structure. And for me, when I've read those in the past, I found the most success with just plowing ahead instead of focusing on every single name in detail. Because there's a lot of books that I've read where there's just like a cast of characters of over 200, and it doesn't really matter. But some of them it will, and I've always found that the importance of certain characters come out over time by how involved they are in the story. But I think that is a factor if you're reading this book. If you're used to picking over every detail, it will be a little bit more challenging at the beginning.
Yeah.
You should plow ahead.
Yeah, you should plow ahead.
Please plow ahead.
I also started.
That's the advice.
I started reading it by listening to and following along with the audiobook that I had already downloaded on Audible like a year ago. I bought it being like, oh, this is popular. I might like this. I might listen to it. Which maybe it gets better. I don't know. The audiobook is like really well produced. It's like Nick Offerman as Bevins, I think. And like a whole cast of characters. Like they have a bunch of different people reading. For all the different parts, but also they say every name every single time.
Oh.
Is like, at least for the first couple chapters. I didn't listen past that, so
I bet
I don't
they
know
will continue,
if they change.
I dislike
but
that.
I was
Yeah.
Greatly.
I was trying to follow along with it, and they kept like, another voice would say like, Hans Wollman. And I was just like, okay, I don't know what's happening.
That makes me feel like the people, like, I don't know. That makes me feel like the producers of that audiobook didn't understand.
They
the
might
structure,
change it.
like-
I don't know if like once you get to know the characters, they drop that. Like I didn't keep listening because that like also I had to keep pausing it to be like, what is happening? Like, who are these people?
My experience in audiobooks like that is it probably doesn't stop.
Yeah. I don't know.
That's
I
very,
don't, I
that's
don't wanna,
very
like,
odd to me. I mean, I guess that's like, it's like the way that you would read it, like verbatim in your head. That is like what your voice reads the name every time. I don't know. That's interesting to me.
So
that they would do that.
There are 2 points on that I'd like to bring up. So with the audiobook structure being so strange because it is more experimental. So I had mentioned that this was one of the books I read in the previous podcast. So this was actually an audiobook. It was Brief Interviews with Hideous Men, the David Foster Wallace one, and he has infamously used footnotes in a lot of his stories, and in the audiobook format it was very jarring because they would say aloud footnote blah blah blah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so it's like I understand
They're
that.
jarring enough when you're reading
Exactly. And so I think that's something to look out for as well. So that's a good warning
Interesting,
for
yeah.
anybody if you haven't started yet and you're thinking about the audiobook. That's something to think about.
And I was really excited for the audiobook because it had like a good cast of characters. Like it's the people that they mention is Nick Offerman and what's his face that writes books that are funny.
David Sedaris.
David Sedaris, I think, is another one.
So here's a point on that. The second point here is Nick Offerman is actually friends with George Saunders and had been before this. And so I can't remember his wife's name, Nick Offerman's wife, but she's in Parks and Rec.
Megan Milani?
Yes,
Megan?
okay.
Something.
So they have known George Saunders, and what I found out is normally George does the audiobooks for his own stories. And so here's another thing that I think we might have mentioned last podcast. George Saunders has only done short stories and short story collections. This is his first novel. He has a famous one, 10th of December, that's mentioned here on the front of our copy of Lincoln and the Bardo. But regardless, his friendship with Nick Offerman, they loved the book, wanted to do the audiobook, and he knew that it probably needed more people. And also, in working on this, I believe, from what I had seen, maybe it was an old article, and I don't know what the progress is on it, but Nick Offerman and Megan Milani are going to produce either a movie, I think it's a movie or a series of Lincoln and the Bardo.
Cool.
I would like that.
I would too.
So
They should call it Sophisticated Haunted Mansion.
and Disney puts their stamp on it.
Disney will produce it.
So
Haunted Mansion 2. Lincoln and
Lincoln.
the Bardo.
I would watch that.
Oh, that would be so good.
I would watch it.
That would be so good. So we did mention that we haven't really talked about.
Sorry. I'm
We mentioned that we haven't really talked about what the book is about, but I think that it is important to talk about structure because that's an important, like I said, important first impression, and that's how you recommend books a lot of times. If you don't know the story all the way or you don't want to spoil something, a lot of times the structure is easy to talk about. But let's get into this a little bit. So it's called Lincoln and the Bardo, and when I had looked that up, Bardo, we were saying we didn't know what that was. Apparently, it is a term for for purgatory, essentially. And he was basing this off of a couple different depictions of the afterlife and purgatory. So it wasn't all stemming from one religion or one culture. I know he had mentioned the Egyptian culture was a big influence in writing about this particular story, and I can't remember the other, but it is about purgatory essentially, and that's how we get into this spooky setting here. You know, a lot of the book is narrated by what we find out to be ghosts, essentially. I don't know what you guys would call them, ghosts or whatever else.
Ghosts.
I think ghosts, or even just like souls,
yeah,
or spirits. I don't know. I think ghosts are good.
Yeah, and so when we're in the afterlife, I mentioned part of the structure. You know, when you're in reality, as in like the living world, when you have those citations
that look real,
and
are sometimes real.
Yeah, because they're all trying to document what's going on while they are in this purgatory state. But when you're in the actual purgatory, you have these ghosts that are narrating it, and it's more in the present as opposed to documenting it. So I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that in particular, or about this purgatory state that he's writing about.
Well, I don't know that I have felt that it's in the present. Like, I don't... Half the time, the way that they talk about it, it's like them remembering what was happening.
Yeah, and I wanted to get to that a little bit later, but go ahead.
Like, it feels like they are together writing a journal, being like, we saw the boy, and he looked, and then somebody else says, exasperated, or whatever. Like, I don't think that it feels like they're narrating exactly what's happening. Like, it feels like they are looking back on this weird thing that happened in their cemetery. I don't know.
I think sometimes though so here's the other thing that we need to bring into this. The reason that we're in this purgatory area in particular is because of its basis around the Lincoln family. And so when we're talking about Lincoln, we're talking about Abraham Lincoln and his family, in case anybody was wondering.
In case that was a source of confusion for anybody.
It actually was Ibrahim Lincoln over
the less famous to George Lincoln.
So basically, the period of time that we're focused around, and it is a very, at least so far, I don't know how much we're going to spread this timeline, but it's focusing on the period of time that Willie, Lincoln's son, was sick and passed away. And so they are talking to him, and I think I found instances where I felt that they were talking to Willie in the present, and they're surprised when Lincoln is coming to visit him, because that's the inspiration for the...
That's
exactly.
I went back and forth, like, in a few chapters thinking one thing, and then, you know, like in the next few chapters just kind of being like, so are they telling a story, or is this actually happening? And then Willie's accounts confused me more than anything, actually, because I couldn't tell at first if he was like, I don't know, it seemed almost like he was writing what he was saying. I know now that it's probably not that, but it feels almost like he was like writing like diary entries or something. The way that he was, the way that the structure of his paragraphs, I don't know, they're kind of piecemeal, and I was just kind of like, so is this like the way that an 11-year-old boy thinks? Is he like, what's going, you know, I was confused about his dialogue a little bit.
I want to bring that up.
There's no like
punctuation, really.
He doesn't finish his sentences.
Willie's is the most different out of anybody that actually has a speaking role where it's not an article. I noticed that multiple times where like instead of periods, sometimes it'll be multiple
just
spaces.
Like a bunch of spaces.
And
his
is very particular.
It's like, it made me think that it's like, first of all, the way like that George Saunders is trying to portray very obviously that he's a child, because his thoughts seem like 75% formed, and then even the spacing, like the visual, looks a little bit all over the place, kind of just like he's overwhelmed, he doesn't know what's going on. So like I think visually it plays a part too, which is really interesting. That's not something you would get if you were listening to the audiobook necessarily.
Yeah, that'd be hard to. I doubt on the audiobook they're saying.
Oh yeah, I didn't get that far.
Yeah, no, that's what. I mean, I don't know. Maybe they do in this audiobook, but yeah, I don't know. I'm really interested.
Or maybe
in
there's
Willie's.
like weird pauses where they're like, "I was walking, and I saw." Like
that's how he writes. That's how he speaks. Or I don't know. I don't know.
But like the main two ghost characters, Roger and Hans. Just looking at it now, like, they talk in the past tense.
Yeah.
Like, they say, we proceeded on. We found the gentleman as he had been described to us. So, I don't know. It feels to me like they are recording this. And that they are putting in dialogue as they remember it.
I'd want to look back on it. I feel like some of it was very particularly the past, especially when they talk about so in this purgatory world there's a lot of people we learn as the story goes along, and we get introduced to them in very interesting ways, most notably by their appearance, which we'll get into a little bit as well. But I think when they're talking about a lot of the people that had died previously, that when they're not talking about Willie in particular, there's a lot in the past because that did already happen. So I think that it would be worth looking into moving forward, because that actually might be the case. I don't think I paid attention enough, but I think that it is a little bit of both. But,
and those parts, like, I felt like they had dialogue of like all the other ghosts. Like there's tons of ghosts
all over the place.
All of them, like, in moments when those ghosts started talking, like the ghosts would talk for a few lines and then they would like break the fourth wall, and Roger or somebody would tell you like, this person does this. Like, he's clearly not talking to them. He's not saying that out loud.
It made me
like
feel
he's talking to you as the reader.
But here's the interesting thing about that dynamic of the two of them. Sometimes when they're talking about each other, even though you know they're telling the story together because they're filling in each other's sentences, they'll still refer to each other in the third person
and tell you things that like you didn't know previously.
But not always.
Yeah.
It really makes me feel like the image that I was getting by the end of the first part is that Roger and Hans are like sitting in a room together, half reminiscing, half like trying to record this, and then like as if you're in a movie, as if you're watching a movie, like everything else that's happening that they're explaining is like projected on a screen, or like, you know, you can see it happening, and they're explaining it and they're looking at it.
They're like narrating.
They're narrating. Then they also give you asides.
It feels like the story pauses and then they walk out of it being like,
it doesn't say
this
that.
is what's going on.
That's how I had to eventually start picturing it, because otherwise the timing and the verb tenses were too ambiguous. So like that's kind of how I interpreted it.
Yeah. So any other thoughts on anything that we had just discussed before we move on?
I don't know.
So that's kind of the general premise of what we're looking at. So as we had mentioned, and obviously this is one of the only things that I knew about the book before I had started reading it, is that a lot of the focus is on Willie Lincoln's death and how Abraham Lincoln was processing it at the time. And it mentions him, as we said, through some of those citations of various articles in history or logs or anything else, about how he visits Willie in his grave many times, and that was the main thing that George Saunders got inspiration from. But we already talked about structure a little bit and about the story itself. But one of the things that we did mention earlier too that I think is worth talking about, that sounds like it'd be a really sad story, but one of the things that I've been enjoying so far have been the fluid shifts in tone. And like I said, we had mentioned it a little bit, but there were funny moments like the description of the moon, for instance, on one of the nights when they were talking about, of course, it was in a sad context where it was a presidential party, but Willie was sick upstairs. But so many different people were saying, oh, it was a full moon that night. As
There was no moon.
And there was a crescent moon and all this stuff. And
The sky was dark.
like all these various accounts, which I thought was like really funny that he brought that up and that he found that it was even important enough to do that in the first place. And then there was also dialogue with the ghost that could get pretty wild and irreverent. Obviously, they don't take everything that seriously, but at the same time, we also had moments of intense grief with Abraham Lincoln and his family that were very powerful, and I just didn't expect there to be that large of a range for a story that I pictured to be very sad. And so what are your thoughts on that aspect of the book? Was it something that you enjoyed? Did you expect it? Kind of break that down.
I was surprised. Again, I went into this not knowing anything, so I didn't know if it was sad or if it was... I mean, like, I knew it was about Abraham Lincoln in some way, which I feel like most stories about Abraham Lincoln end up being sad. Like, that just feels like... Because his life was... Like, he had a lot of really awesome, wonderful, good things that happened, but also, like, there were a lot of sad things. A lot of tragedy. But the first chapter, this is part of the thing that kept confusing me, that was like one of our main ghost narrators, I think it's Hans, right? Hans is talking first, yeah. Hans Vollman is talking about like this woman that he got married to, and then it's like a very like succinct story, and then towards the end of that part where he's talking, he just like starts talking about poop. And I was so confused. I was like, what is happening? He's like,
he says the word poop.
Yeah, he's like, I pooped in my sick box. And I was just like, what is going on? What does this mean? Why? And like, I didn't understand that this narrator was dead and that's what it's like. He died, and you excrete things when you die. Like, I didn't understand what was happening. So I was really surprised in that like moment of like, this feels weird.
Yeah.
This feels like it doesn't match the tone of what was just happening. But I do really enjoy like the whimsical sides of the main narrators, and also those moments of like historical inaccuracies. The moon one, I remember I read that before Brian had started reading any of the book, and I was sitting there being like, I want to tell him about this because it's funny.
And it goes on for so long.
Yeah.
Like it's not like he
like
does 3. He
pages
does like
it's
a
a whole
lot.
chapter of just here are descriptions of the moon that are not the same on the same night.
Like very specific, like I could see the moon through the 3rd floor window and it was covered by a cloud, and then like other people were just like, there was no moon.
Yeah.
The sky was
you could
dark.
see no stars,
And, yeah.
no moon. Yeah. So I really enjoyed the like shift in tone, because also I feel like this could be a really, really sad, like kind of like mind-numbingly depressing story. Like depending on how you told it, it could be like, okay, I get it. He's sad. He comes to visit him. Like, it's sad. But I like the whimsical asides.
Dani, thoughts?
Yeah, I'm in the middle of Brian and Jaimie in terms of like knowing about this book. Brian knew a lot about it, and I really only knew like what I read from the inside cover. And what stuck with me was it says that it unfolds in a graveyard and it's narrated by a dazzling chorus of voices. And I was like, what does that even mean? I was like, how many narrators does this book have? I didn't understand. So that clarified a little bit. Like when you see the people's names under like every, like statement, every sentence, every paragraph, I was just like, okay, so these are different narrators, but you're right. It was very like, I don't know. It was interesting to read Hans's, especially at the beginning, because I was just like, I don't know what's going on. Like, who is this narrator? Like, and then, it was like pages and pages before I caught on to like everything that was happening. But yeah, I mean, I agree with Jaimie. It like very much feels like it could just be like a sad historical fiction, or even just like a little biography almost of like Lincoln and his son. But it makes it much more interesting, I think, to be told in this way. And I think it was comforting for me to read about this, really sad event in President Lincoln's life, but to have it be told by like these very likable ghost characters that are introduced at the very beginning. And so like even a few chapters in, you have a relationship with Hans and Roger
Bevins, yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, even a few chapters in, you're just like, oh, like these are like old, I don't know, grandfatherly, nice men. I don't know.
And that's part of the reason. Like, I feel like they're like sitting in chairs telling you this story,
like reminiscing,
because there's like even moments when they are narrating that could be very sad, like them describing how Lincoln is walking through the graveyard or whatever. But like, Hans will have this long description that's really depressing, and then there'll be just one line from Bevins that's like, quite so. Like, you're just like, you're here.
Excruciating. And
I concur.
It brings you back to like them just having a conversation rather than just like pages and pages of just like, and then he died, and then he visited him, and then
it's like, it's a funny pause of like, yes, quite so.
Quite so.
Yeah, and I think that part of what makes this book unique in that way is that, there have been so many. Oh, we have another host join the podcast.
We have dogs.
A couple dogs here. But there's been so many books written about Lincoln, both in biographies or other pieces of historical fiction. But what makes it so interesting is this isn't so focused on Lincoln. And if it was, it wouldn't have the ability to have that wide range of tone. And so I think that that's what's so cool about it. But all the same, what I also liked about it so much is that it still does find ways to tackle a lot about Lincoln himself and the Civil War. It's not just brushed aside. And so here's a one that I'm kind of thinking of here is, we're thinking of the afterlife and about Willie, but, the gravity of the situation that we're in the middle of a civil war. This had happened in a chapter where they're finally getting the actual numbers of how many people have died thus far. And so there's somebody that says, how many more dead do you attend to make, sir, afore you is done? 1 minute there's our little Nate on that bridge with a fish pole, and where is that boy now? And who is it called him hither in that notice he saw down on the Orbis? Well, sir, that was your name he saw upon it, Abraham Lincoln. And it's still bringing up the fact that, like, despite the fact that Lincoln is grieving, and that's on page 154 in my copy here for anybody wondering. But, you get this outside perspective where, again, it's not just focusing on Lincoln and becoming the same story. You have other perspectives to keep it light, but also other perspectives to be like, hey, you're grieving, but you're also the president. You also have all this other stuff to deal with.
Like, shit is going down.
And not everybody's happy about it. That guy is upset that Lincoln is the one that's essentially calling people in to fight, because that's his job. So I thought that was another powerful aspect, because, we're talking about a lot of the lighthearted aspects of the novel. And while there's a lot of that, it's very centered in a very serious subject matter. And the fact that this is a book about death in a war where there's no winning side, because it's the same country, same amount. I mean, there's no, you could argue that for most wars, but these are people that are getting divided in their own homeland, and we're learning about some of these stories even after they end in the living world. So I think that that's super cool about the book, and that was one passage that stood out that still tied it into the Lincoln story that we know, so that it's not just pushed aside in the book, but I appreciate the other aspects of it too.
Yeah. And you also, there was a moment past that, I think, that Volman and Bevins are like sitting inside of Lincoln, which is a weird.
Yeah, that was a very strange.
It's so interesting. I love that.
So descriptive.
Yeah.
They're inside
The coffee.
of him,
I taste the coffee.
and they're like, they're feeling his thoughts and emotions, and it's right after like someone was newly buried in the cemetery who was a soldier, and you see like Lincoln sitting there trying to like wrestle with the idea that like everybody is losing sons, and he didn't understand that until like just now, like what that felt like. And he feels like he's like at a weird crossroads of like, what do I do? Like, am I supposed to just stop and be like a weakling? Like, how I have to keep going, but also like, now that I understand how this feels, like it sucks. Like is such an interesting perspective on him that I had never, addressed before. That he, in the middle of all of this, like also lost a son, but from other circumstances, and how he might have dealt with that, we don't know for sure. I don't think, but I really liked that moment.
Yeah. And the thing that is also something that's cool that ties both of those aspects together is, with that aspect, and I may be getting this wrong here in what I interpreted from it, but they did talk about a point where the two main narrators had a connection to Lincoln because of that period where they sat in him or whatever. And they then used that because they talked about it for multiple pages of like, after that experience, I, felt more close to Lincoln. I understood him a lot better. And I think they have a moment where they actually tell Lincoln's thoughts. Like that's part of the story that they're telling, which I think is really cool because, there are some pieces of information from that time in history of how Lincoln handled his son dying and some of the thoughts that he had. But when you get to that moment, it's just showing how much he still cares about this boy that was so good. There were other chapters that were like talking about how great of a boy Willie actually was. But I thought that it was cool that you got Lincoln's inner thoughts that weren't from an article for the first time. Pretty much the entire book, you're getting those inner thoughts. So it's practically like Lincoln's telling you himself, but it's from Hans in that particular instance. So I thought that was cool that it molded both of those aspects together.
Hans and Roger like realizing who he is.
Yeah.
I love
that
because they are both
I believe it is indeed.
they're both so old and they haven't like there's
that was great.
There's a lack of acknowledging of where they are and what's happening to them and how much time has passed. And so they're like, I believe it's Lincoln. It's President Lincoln.
They
but wait,
they feel it because they learn it.
The president is so and so. They both have different ideas on who the president is supposed to be, and then they like suddenly gain knowledge after like embodying Lincoln. They're like, oh, there were like eight
when
presidents.
When I died, it was Polk. But now
I've been here for a little bit. Yeah.
Which was I loved that moment.
I think also now that you say that, like part of the confusion that I felt like at the beginning and the ambiguity we were all kind of talking about is that the main characters kind of refuse to acknowledge where they are and what is happening.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not like, they sit you down and say, we are ghosts and we're going to tell you about, or like it is the year 1862. They don't know. No. And they like have refused to acknowledge it, or they, they don't think it's pertinent information. And so that's also like part of the ambiguity that I felt I'm realizing now is that like the main characters don't help you.
Yeah.
They don't really help in terms of like, telling a story to people. Yeah. They don't give you a setting really.
There was a moment where like one of the characters, they were describing one of the other ghosts, and they were like, he's been here for quite a few years. And like in my mind, I was like, okay, so he's been here for like 2 or 3 years.
Like, yeah.
But then that guy started talking about like a street, like on this corner, there's this hotel. And then the other ghost was like, nah, dude, that's a field. And I'm like, how long has he been here? Like,
Right.
Just hundreds of years. Yeah. Like, I don't.
The timeline is like learning about how long all of them have been there, and then like when all of the other ghosts come in, like when they're when they share all of their thoughts, it's just like it confuses a little more. I don't know.
Cool. Well, I think we're getting a little bit far along on the discussion. So obviously we have another half of the book. So we're just going to get to some final thoughts here. And obviously if anybody's listening, if you're on YouTube, you can leave some comments below. We'll be checking those out and responding to some. Somebody will. But the thing I want to end off on is obviously this is a part 1 of 2. We're going to be finishing the book next week. So in part of your response, I'm curious on where you think the book is leading, if you have any thoughts on that at all, and also any other final thoughts of things you liked or disliked or things that relate to other books. It's kind of a free-for-all, but just kind of your final thoughts here. But the main one is, where do you think the book's going, if you think it's going anywhere? So I'll just start so you guys can have some time to think about it. One of the cool things that I really enjoyed, which this is something that tied in a little bit to a book we talked about last week, is there's a particular slang that's used in this story. And so when they're talking about people dying, what their dead body looks like, or where they're housed, for instance, they say like sick box. That would be their grave, their coffin, and then sick form, that's their dead bodies. And it kind of gave me some flashbacks to A Clockwork Orange. We talked about that last week, how they kind of have their own slang. And I know that it's a little bit more minimal, but this ties into another point from earlier on in the podcast, in that I like a lot of unique aspects to books, and that includes if they have their own slang, because it really ties it to that world. There are certain things that you still hear from A Clockwork Orange, like horror show. You know exactly what they're talking about if you have read that book. Same thing here. Not every book's saying sick form or sick box, which I think is kind of a cool thing, that not only is there a unique structure, but there's a slang that's involved in this purgatory state. So that's pretty cool. And then as far as where things are going, or where I want them to go, what I'm curious about is we're just now getting into those aspects where a lot of the ghosts that are in this state right now, they're starting to reveal that people have the choice to move on.
Yeah.
And we don't get much more information on that. And, we don't know why the narrators haven't chosen that. Obviously, they've been here for a long time. What's holding them back? Do they have any other motives to why they're here? And what's Willie's choice going to be? And how does that kind of resolve there? So those are a couple thoughts from me.
I have thoughts about your thoughts because I don't know that I view that as slang so much as like, one of my favorite parts of the novel is that the main characters, like we already kind of talked about, are like, they don't acknowledge what's actually happening. And I think Hans especially, like anytime somebody is about to reference a grave, Hans interrupts and says like sick box. Like they'll pause and Hans is the one that says sick form or sick box. Like he has not acknowledged that he has died. That is like fully obvious to me.
Interesting.
I hadn't realized that it was only him.
I'm pretty sure it's only Hans.
So I noticed that too, but my interpretation was the opposite. I interpreted as Roger refusing to acknowledge and refusing to say the word, and he wanted Hans to say it for him.
Okay.
So he was stopping, and Hans was saying it. But I think that
was filling something in.
He was filling in as opposed to interrupting him. But I think yours is equally plausible too.
Yeah, I see it as him interrupting, like not like,
Being like, don't
he,
say it.
He recognizes that they're about to say like his
Coffin,
dead body,
yeah.
and he's like, no, sick form.
Hold on.
Excuse me.
Please stop.
Well, and because I thought
Sorry.
that because there's that moment, the first time that we see like all of the weird like demons, they call them like demons coming to take them away, that they all see as different people. Hans, the people that come to take him are like a bunch of brides, and at the bottom of page 98 they say, "Are you sick, Kugel?" Like in quotes, like, "Are you sick? Do doctors put sick people into sick boxes?" I don't recall that practice ever happening. Like, he like knows somewhere deep down in him that that's not right, and he's not acknowledging it, which I like that. I think that's my favorite part of the book, is like there's those characters are whimsical. Hans and Roger are both kind of like funny, like, I don't know, almost like the cranky like old men,
kind of like
Muppets,
crotchety old men, yeah.
like in the background, like commenting on everything that's happening, but in like a whimsical way. But also there's something really sad about both of them.
Yeah.
Like, really, like, they are tormented in a lot of ways.
And they have to be because they're still there. Like, that's
Yeah.
part of, because that's the thing, is somebody that did pass on did it almost immediately. There was a moment in the book that they were surprised. They're like, wow.
Like, he did it. All right.
He's out.
Okay.
He's missing out on a lot of good stuff, but maybe it's not that great.
But also, like, the main arc of the story right now with Willie is that they want him to move on. They're like, young people aren't meant to be here, and we don't understand why he is struggling to move on. So I guess that's what I see going forward. I assume that the resolution of the story will be, like, Willie finds a way to move on. Like, something resolves the issue that he's having. But maybe that's, like, too perfect of a bow to wrap up the story. But that's kind of what I'm expecting, is just, like, them trying to help him.
Dani?
Yeah, to go back to the sick box talk, on page 5, like at the very beginning, I think it's Hans has just only been speaking. It's only Hans. He says, "Per the advice of my physician, I took to my sick box," like a sort of sick box was judged. So like he's refusing like that he has died. It's not, that's like the ultimate euphemism.
Yeah.
Like, per the advice of my physician, like, you're dead. You had to go into that coffin. Like, you didn't choose to do it. So yeah, so that was another clue to me that like there's a little bit of denial happening, or deliberate ignorance, or like confusion about where they are. I had another thing to talk about. Well, I guess in terms of like where I think the book's going to go, how it's going to resolve, I was a little confused at first because they kept talking about the children being the ones who moved on really quickly. And I was like, okay, so is it only the children who are allowed to move on? And then I started thinking about in Harry Potter, when they talk about the ghosts, they talk about how the ghosts are like spirits who have chosen to stay in basically purgatory ghost world forever. And they always speak of the people who have chosen to go on in a pretty wistful way. And I get that as well. Our main characters speak about the children who enter and then leave pretty easily and without much, fuss. They speak about them pretty kind of wistfully, like they wish it were that easy. And so that's a big question mark too, is just like, what have they chosen? Why are they still there? What are they doing there? Kind of.
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of questions still to be answered. As we've mentioned, it is going to be just 2 parts per book, so we will be done by the next episode. So if anybody's following along, just know what you're getting into next week, but next week, whenever it's going to be.
Oh, next week. We can do next week.
We're doing a podcast every day, 2 books, it's easy. So anyway, that's going to be the end of part 1 of our discussion of Lincoln and the Bardo here at the podcast.
Haunted Mansion 2, Lincoln and the Bardo.
The podcast.
But we're glad you joined us for this one. Hopefully we'll see you again on the next episode. And yeah, thanks for joining us tonight. Dani, could you sing the outro?
Stop putting me on the spot. Beebe doo bop.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.